experts, guests, welcome to the roundtable on organized crime and criminal traditions. With the rapid changes in our world, and a person caring for his or her welfare, either a business owner or an expert in a particular field or a public figure, anyone requires to be informed about the criminological situation globally. For the purpose of researching on this issue, the Center for Criminological Research and European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine traditionally conduct roundtables with foremost experts in criminology from all over the world. And today, we're glad to welcome the reunion of experts in the framework of roundtables since the fundamental international discussion held in September 2020. I'm sincerely honored and pleased to welcome everyone to the roundtable on organized crime and criminal traditions arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. So the key discussion points of the current roundtable are the discussion questions. So the first one, what are the current tendencies in criminalization on the national and transnational levels and prognosis for the 2021 and relevant crime prevention methods? I'm Irina Lopatyuk, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. And right away, let me please introduce our speakers right in the way they're given the floor. Emilio Viano, President of the International Society for Criminology, President at Bellagio Forum for World Security and Social Development, Vice President of the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Professor Viano is on Harvard University list of national security professors, Editor-in-Chief of the International Annals of Criminology, Cambridge University Press, a member of the Board of Directors of the International Association of Penal Law, AIDP, and of the International Society for Social Defense. Welcome. Our next speaker is Dr. Oleg Maltsev, the author, criminologist, psychologist, photographer, investigative journalist, business strategy consultant, academician of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, founder of Criminalistics Institute and Expeditionary Corps. He has been conducting scientific research of history, structure, and weapon handling techniques of Russian, South Italian, Spanish, African, and Mexican criminal traditions for decades. Dr. Maltsev is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, criminology, editor of several interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Dr. Maltsev. Our next speaker is Jeffrey Danik, consultant, investigator, former FBI leader with diverse 28-year career and significant experience across all FBI program lines. Danik has extensive experience with the FBI undercover program. His assignments included as a supervisor and acting watch commander in the FBI's counterterrorism division. Jeffrey Danik holds the unique distinction of serving as an acting assistant agent in charge of both in a violent crime and a white-collar crime branch of a major FBI field office. We're pleased to greet you. Our next speaker is James Finkenauer, organized crime expert, author, distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University, former director of the National Institute of Justice, Washington, D.C. Dr. Finkenauer is an expert in human trafficking, juvenile, and international criminal justice, author of numerous books on Russian organized crime in the US. Welcome, sir. And our next speaker would be Alexander Sainchin, Doctor of Law, academician of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, chairman of the Humanitarian Scientific Society. He is a lawyer, author of many monographs and scientific works in the field of criminalistics. And let me please deliver just a few words about the referent terms of this discussion. So each speaker holds the opportunity to answer 2 questions formulated and presented. So please limit the extent of your answers up to 8-10 minutes, no longer, please. And to begin with, we shall start the discussion on the very first issue. What are the current tendencies in criminalization of the national and transnational levels? And by this, let me please give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Greetings, dear colleagues.
Мне очень жаль, что некоторые из наших с вами дорогих коллег заболели и не смогли принять участие в этом круглом столе.
It is very unfortunate that some of our colleagues that traditionally always take part in this round tables are sick right now and cannot take part.
Ну, как бы, как говорится, в любом случае плановые мероприятия в виде круглого стола у нас происходят, и даже при отсутствии как бы наших коллег мы постараемся как бы сделать так, чтобы то, что мы сделаем, осталось заметным, как говорится, в истории.
However, since these regular tables are always conducted and we will conduct them regardless of what is happening, and we will do our best to make this event significant so it stays in the timeline of history.
У нас говорят, что новое – это хорошо забытое старое.
In Russian, there is a saying that new things are good things that are just forgot, things from the past.
Я недавно как бы читал переведенную для меня итальянскую книгу 1860 года.
Recently, I've been reading a book which was translated for me from Italian, dated by 1860.
То есть это еще до объединения Италии было.
And it explained events that happened even before the unification of Italy.
И с моей точки зрения это шикарная криминологическая работа, как бы, в общем-то, осталась, наверное, за кадром для многих, потому что она написана на итальянском языке.
And this is a great criminological work which is not accessible to many people just because it's written in Italian.
И там я прочитал очень созвучные мысли, которые я высказывал уже несколько лет.
And it has certain thoughts that are very significant, and I've been adhering to those thoughts for many years.
То есть, смотря на криминологический фон Европы, России, Украины, как бы и других, как бы, в общем-то, стран, как бы, я все больше и больше прихожу к выводу, что мы становимся заложниками конфликта.
And by looking at the criminological background, which is happening, which takes place in Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe, I tend to think that we are becoming the prisoners of the conflict.
То есть, по сути, между демократически избранными институтами
So basically, among democratically elected institutions
и профессионализмом людей в этих институтах.
and professionalism of people in those institutions.
То есть, как бы в мире считается, что лучшая форма, которая существует, свободна, это демократия.
It is conventionally accepted that the best form, like regime for people, is democracy.
Но демократия это не есть непрофессионализм.
However, democracy doesn't necessarily mean professionalism.
То есть, по сути своей, воля демократически избранных институтов на сегодняшний день такова, что подавляющее большинство людей, которые там как бы работают и заняты в сфере борьбы с преступностью, они, в общем-то, профессионалы очень невысокого уровня.
So what happens is that those democratically people that were democratically elected to work at those institutions, they do not have the proper level of qualification usually.
И эта история, она очень как бы давняя.
And the sequence, this story is quite an old one.
Все фильмы в Голливуде, в американском, построены по принципу, что когда НАСА ничего не может, появляется какой-то один чудак, который спасает весь мир.
And even like in the cinematography, Hollywood has demonstrated a lot of movies when there is one person comes up from NASA and he saves the entire world.
Да, то есть как бы по сути своей этот конфликт, он давно существует, уже 1000 раз высмеян во всех фильмах, которые только возможно.
Basically, this conflict that we are speaking about it has been existing for a long time and had been shown even in a ridiculed manner in the cinematography.
Да, и я не беру Россию, как бы это особое государство, как бы там, ну как бы особый режим.
And I'm not talking about Russia just because it's a different type of state which has a different regime.
Да, а вот если посмотреть на демократические страны, обратите внимание, как бы, как они себя ведут в сегодняшних как бы условиях.
However, if we take a look at the democratic countries, please take a look at the way they do behave in today's conditions.
То есть, по сути своей, только две страны как бы более-менее справились с карантином. Это Британия и Израиль.
Basically, roughly speaking, there are two countries that more or less did quite well in coping with the emergency of the pandemic, which is Britain and Israel.
То есть там нет карантина.
I mean, they do not have the quarantine there.
А вот Европа, вся остальная, она, в общем-то, сидит и думает, ну, делает вид, что она думает, как же ей победить карантин.
But entire Europe, it seems that they are sitting and contemplating how we're going to beat this pandemic.
И как бы, ну, мы прекрасно понимаем, что если, ну, в одних государствах с карантином разобрались и все в порядке, как бы почему не могут разобраться в других государствах?
And if some countries are able to deal with the emergency situation in an effective way, then why other states are not capable of doing that?
Да, и, в общем-то, получается такая ситуация, что, видимо, ну, очень многие люди не хотят, чтобы в Европе разобрались с карантином.
And it seems that the situation is as follows. There are many people that for whom is not advantageous that Europe deals effectively with the quarantine.
И получается такая ситуация, что когда возникла эта пандемия какая-то, то все прям раз и испугались в Европе, боже, пандемия.
And when this emergency situation has happened, Europe was like in an awe, telling, "Oh, we are confronting a pandemic."
Сегодня, если мы смотрим на ура, пандемия.
But I mean, in fact, what happens? People are like almost celebrating the pandemic.
Да, потому что все, кому не лень, эту пандемию используют уже в своих интересах.
Because at the moment, almost everybody is trying to use pandemic in his or her interests.
И я как раз сегодня заканчивал писать книгу по криминологии.
And today I'm finishing writing one of the books in criminology.
И я как бы в заключении написал, что старый криминал, который существовал, он уже давно интегрировался во власть. Вот в ту самую демократическую волю.
And one of the theses of the book is that I write that the old criminal that existed, it already infiltrated the establishment that were democratic institutions. It got blended with it.
А новый криминал, который возник, электронный там и прочее, теперь вроде как стал криминалом.
And a new criminal which emerged, electronical or one, I mean, related to internet threats, etc., it became as if a new criminality.
Да, и получается так, что старый криминал как бы исчез, его как бы в общем-то нету.
So the situation is as if the old criminal doesn't exist anymore, as if it has completely disappeared.
То есть для нас это, в общем-то, стало нормальным.
For us, for people, it became a normal state of affairs.
То есть я когда-то как бы спрашивал, когда последний раз какой руководитель страны садился на скамью подсудимых за то, что он вытворял в течение своей вот этой вот деятельности.
One of the questions for contemplation is that when was the last time when an elected official was brought to court for his misdoings?
Да, то есть когда в последний раз кто-то как бы вскрывал какие-то взаимоотношения, то есть между разными государствами, которые как бы были сугубо криминальными, не политическими, а именно криминальными.
So when was the last time when relationships between different actors were really looked into, not the political relationships one, but their criminal acts?
Я вам отвечу, никогда.
And the answer is never. They were never. They were not held accountable for their acts.
И поэтому, как бы по сути своей, мы все сегодня заложники вот этих демократически избранных институтов, которые, ну, в большинстве состоят из криминала и некомпетентных как бы людей.
So in a nutshell, we have become the prisoners of the democratically elected institutions, which consist, roughly speaking, half of them are old criminal, and half of them are people that have inadequate proficiency level.
И обратите внимание на то, что во всех известных как бы странах нет ни одной недели, которая бы не обходилась без какого-то криминального скандала.
And if we take a look at what is happening in leading countries these days, there's not even 1 week when they do not have really serious events related to crime. I mean, they always make those headlines.
И как бы кому-то казалось, что пандемия – это жизнь до пандемии и после пандемии.
So for some, they consider this recent emergency situation as if there was a life before pandemic and after pandemic life.
То есть и кто-то говорил, что люди поймут, что нужно все менять.
And some even thought that and said that people will understand finally that something has to change.
Но на самом деле человек устроен по-другому.
But the human nature is different.
Ему намного легче использовать то, что существует, нежели что-то менять.
For a human being, it's way more easier to exploit and use things that already exist instead of changing something.
Научились использовать в своих интересах и пандемию.
And people found out their way to use pandemic for their own use, in their self-interest.
И как бы вся разница между нашим криминалом и европейским криминалом заключается только в одном.
And the only difference between the criminality on the Russian-speaking area and European criminal is only the one thing.
Что там они это делают за государственные деньги, то есть, по сути, воруют деньги у государства.
In Europe, the difference is that people do things for the money, for the finances of the government, basically they steal.
А у нас это делается за деньги граждан.
And here on Russian-speaking area, criminality does their acts by using money of its citizens.
И делается это постоянно, и все уже привыкли к тому, что должен быть карантин, и криминал на этом карантине должен зарабатывать баснословные деньги.
And these things are done quite regularly, and pandemic is just one of the ways how to make money for criminals out of the situation.
Притом, обратите внимание, это тот самый старый добрый криминал, да, который как бы теперь вроде как уже и не криминал.
However, please pay attention that things related to the pandemic relates to the old criminal, which is a criminal. However, it is not even regarded like that anymore. Like today.
То есть, по сути своей, до тех пор, пока мы будем заложниками вот этих демократически избранных как бы институтов и не сможем вносить изменения в это во все с профессиональной точки зрения, до тех пор, пока не появятся законы, которые регулируют их деятельность таким способом, что они не смогут как бы использовать свои служебные как бы положения для того, чтобы зарабатывать как бы деньги, это будет продолжаться бесконечно.
And until the moment the situation is not changed in the sense that if we are not going to stop being prisoners of this democratically elected institutions, where if certain professional, like different laws, different rules, if they're not introduced that would allow to modify certain things and regulate the acts of people that really abuse and misabuse their power, if these things are not done, that emergency situations that we saw recently, they are going to continue and take just different shapes and forms.
И многие люди, они периодически, когда я говорю там на конференции или где-то, они говорят, ну что вы, доктор Мальцев, этого не может быть.
And many people, like whenever we have conferences or other events, some people say, no, there's no way, Dr. Maltsev, what you are speaking about.
Я вам приведу один пример, который вас должен развеселить.
And as a response to that, I would like to give an example that is going to make you smile.
В Украине 2 президента назад был президент Янукович, который сбежал в Россию.
So on the example of Ukraine, before this recent 2 presidents, we had Yanukovych as a president who ran away later to Russian Federation.
Так вот он трижды судим за уголовные преступления умышленные.
Just for your record, Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, was he faced criminal charges for criminal acts that were intentionally made by him.
И это не какое-то там мошенничество.
And it is not about like very petty crime. It's not like robbery type of thing.
Это не какие-то экономические статьи.
These were not economical crimes.
То есть я допускаю, что любого бизнесмена можно обвинить в чем угодно.
Because I do keep in mind that any businessman could be basically made guilty because of anything.
Это грабеж.
When I'm speaking about Yanukovych's crimes, it's about like huge robberies,
Разбой.
about like conquering, basically doing acts that entail physical damage.
И хулиганство.
And hooliganism.
Да, то есть как бы эти три статьи с реальными отбытыми сроками.
So these were three charges that he faced, and he was responsible for them. I mean, he was imprisoned for a certain period of time.
Потом он вроде как одумался.
Afterwards, probably he thought twice.
Стал порядочным человеком.
Became pious citizen.
Даже стал бизнесменом.
And even became a businessman.
А потом президентом Украины.
And then he became a president of Ukraine.
За которого проголосовала вся Украина.
And entire Ukraine did vote for him.
И сколько им не говорили, что он 3 раза судим за умышленные преступления, все говорили, но он же хороший.
And no matter when people brought up the news and told, well, he is a convict, he faced 3 times criminal charges. People know, they said, no, we're going to elect this man as a president.
Я понимаю, что в Америке это невозможно.
I do understand that this kind of scenario would have been impossible in the United States of America.
Да, и потому что и мои соотечественники очень часто большинство американцев считают придурками.
And a lot of people, here in Ukraine, they consider Americans to be idiots.
Да, но американским политикам хватает мозгов.
However, American politicians, they have the brains, they have enough of wit.
Таким как Трамп, который не меньше преступник, чем Янукович.
People like Trump, who is no less criminal than Yanukovych.
Да, не выставлять это на показ всему государству.
So what I'm trying to tell that American politicians are smart enough not to protrude it and make it public, by showing all their bad negative sides.
Поэтому еще вопрос, кто умнее.
And it's a huge question, who is more smart.
Да, поэтому как бы мы всегда будем оставаться заложниками вот этого конфликта между профессиональными как бы кадрами и демократически избранными институтами. Я вот 5 или 6 раз прочитал этот абзац в этой книге по криминологии в итальянской вот этой книге как бы 1860 года.
And so this conflict is everlasting. The conflict between professionals, real professionals, versus democratically elected institutions. So the book that I was speaking about, 1860, about criminology, I've read that paragraph for about 5 or 6 times.
И как бы, в общем-то, подумал, что как это близко, то есть то, что написано в 1660 году, и то, что в 21 году происходит, как бы, как это близко между собой, да, то есть так ничего и не разрешилось.
And I thought, how similar are these events that are being described in 1860 and today in 21st century? Nothing had really changed.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltsev, for your speech. And by this, let me please kindly remind you that the first discussion point is the question, what are the current tendencies in criminalization on the national and transnational levels? And by this moment, please let me give the floor to the president of the International Society for Criminology, Professor Emilio Viano. Please, you're welcome. Please turn on your microphone.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be part of this panel and to address the consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic might have on organized crime and on its activities. There is no question, we already all know this, that COVID-19 pandemic has transformed the lives of communities around the world. People have had to adapt to new restrictions placed on their work, on their life, on their everyday freedoms, while governments and international organizations are facing the twin challenges of having to enforce public health measures at the same time with reduced services and also to minimize the economic damage. This certainly has a long-term impact on how we live in society and how organized crime might take advantage of the situation. Controlling people's freedom of movement has become, we all know, an essential priority for governments seeking to slow the spread of virus. Security forces, the police, the military have been called upon to enforce the community's compliance with the new order and are therefore rapidly becoming the public face of states' response to the virus. The level of political legitimacy enjoyed by security institutions will determine their power to make or to break this response. Lack of trust, for example, between police and the communities is likely to make citizens less willing to abide by new lockdown measures. We have seen quite a bit of that here in the US. At the same time, criminal justice systems are struggling to fulfill their usual mandates as social distancing measures and diminished resources take their toll. The orientation of the state security apparatus is shifting fundamentally. In places where state reach may be weak, there may be even agreements with criminal bosses and groups that might help to enforce social distancing measures and eventually public order itself. If we want to summarize in a certain sense the implications that the pandemic has for organized crime and the associated illicit market activity and how this might affect the state's ability to respond both to the virus itself and to long-term organized crime policing, we could say the following and begin with this. Some organized crime activities have been constrained by social distancing measures and travel restrictions and will take time to reconstitute themselves. So there is no question that, at least initially, this constraint has had an impact on the ability of organized crime to conduct business. At times, it may be only a short-term impact, in my opinion, as illicit activities rapidly reconstitute themselves to meet both the old and the new market demands. Social distancing measures and lockdowns, for example, have had an impact on violent street crime, both in diminishing it in certain cases and in increasing it in other cases. For example, in the US, there has been a spike in murders and in attacks against citizens with firearms. So it can have an impact positive or an impact negative, depending, of course, on the situation and also particularly on the availability of arms. In general, however, the fact that there is a lockdown, fewer people on the street, as a result, the chances of a perpetrator getting away are dramatically reduced. There is no question about it. In the sense that it is much more difficult, for instance, to sell drugs on the corner of the street when there is no one around. One is easily identified and found, let's say, by the police. While it may be too early to tell what the longer-term impact on rates of violence might be, the constraints on freedom of movement also are constraining criminal groups. For example, in Italy, a long-sought head of the 'Ndrangheta in southern Italy was arrested by police for contravening the lockdown restrictions. So he had been sought by police for over 10 years, and he fell into the hands of the police because of the lockdown measures. More broadly, a reduction in Chinese exports, for example, to the rest of the world is taking its toll on the revenues of criminal groups. China is the leading source of counterfeit and illicit trade groups globally. And with Chinese factories not functioning for a time at full speed, criminal enterprises find themselves without alternative sources of what they normally are selling. While Chinese-sourced illegal goods have naturally been the first hit by the lockdowns, the prospective impact may hit illicit flows around the world. Europe, the US, are the most significant destination markets for a wide array of illicitly traded commodities, and the significantly heightened border controls as a result of the outbreak have impacted cross-border trafficking and smuggling supply chains. The transportation of goods and people is being limited to far fewer official border posts, and which have higher levels of surveillance capacity, thereby increasing the risk for the smugglers hoping to transport contraband goods. Furthermore, extensive lockdown and the closure of borders to human movement will make it more difficult for human smugglers to ply their trade into and across Europe, the US, and other countries. They may nevertheless attempt to capitalize on the desperation of migrants who are stranded between reaching their final destination by upping prices for transporting them to their destination. There is no question that in this respect, human smuggling is being impacted considerably. The initial reports from Europe and the US suggest that countries under lockdown or social distancing policies in those countries, talking about drugs now, the drug supply lines have been disrupted. Frontline dealers, for example, in all corners of the globe, are seeing the effect of people being progressively moved off the street, which is, of course, their major point of sale. Whether this will prompt a shift to online and dark web markets remains to be totally studied, but it certainly did mutate from the street to the web markets and online. There are other frontline criminal industries that will suffer. As local businesses shut down worldwide, their capacity to sell illicit goods is reduced. And as commerce is impacted economically, the capacity of mafia groups to solicit protection taxes and other types of extortion will also be thwarted, will also be diminished. So this is one point. There is a certain diminishing of the activity, diminishing of the revenue of organized crime, but there is always the possibility that they will find other channels like the web and the internet and delivery at home. The second point is that the disruption caused by the coronavirus has been quickly exploited by some criminal groups as a window to scale up their activity. In other words, there is no question that the organized crime is very, very supple, very capable of adapting to the situation, and therefore taking advantage of new possibilities. This applies to all sorts of activities that make money for organized crime. For example, the illegal wildlife trade has been implicated in these coronavirus-related trends. So traders based in China and Laos in South Asia have been marketing rhino horn products as cures for coronavirus. Conservation groups have responded, of course, saying that rhino horn in traditional medicine has no medical value. But still, there is no question that the ingenuity of organized crime in adapting to the situation has been considerable. The third point I want to make is that the health sector constitutes itself an important target for criminal groups, particularly those who have been long embedded there. In other words, as the pandemic sparks demand for medical supplies, masks, vaccines, and there is misinformation that spreads confusion, criminal groups are seizing this opportunity very well. So, for example, the sales of counterfeit medical products have surged since the outbreak, as have incidents of smuggling and theft of medical supplies. In the online world, which for those confined to their home has become the major means of interacting with the outside world, scams have proliferated as criminals exploit fear and trust in institutions to defraud people. This is all over the place. All of us receive every day a number of phone calls that are definitely scams, particularly where the criminal groups are already well integrated into the pharmaceutical institution, the hospital, the clinics. There is definitely there too the possibility of influencing, for example, the supply systems, and to become part and steal from the funds that are provided, for example, by government to buy the goods that are necessary, the vaccines, the masks, oxygen, whatever is necessary. And this weakens the response and ultimately costs life. There are all sorts of interceptions of vast amounts of stock of medical face masks, for example, hand sanitizers. In Italy, for example, police have seized counterfeit masks in several regions. Adverts for masks and hand sanitizers, etc., have emerged on the dark web forums, while hundreds of sites on the open web market discounted masks that may not be legitimate or even exist or be useful. So, for example, Interpol has already intervened in this respect, and in overseeing what is going on, found that about authorities from 90 countries have taken collective action against the illicit online sales of medicine and medical products. In some countries, however, organized crime has long infiltrated the medical supply chain and the health systems. Corruption is a major challenge and one that will continue to impair the state's ability to respond effectively to the pandemic. Italy again, I mention it because I know it pretty well, which has at some point of the pandemic suffered very high number of deaths. In Italy, organized crime networks have been penetrating the healthcare system, both public and private, for years. Such networks include the classics, the Cosa Nostra in Sicily, the Camorra in Naples, the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria. While mafia infiltration of healthcare appears to be concentrated in the country's in southern Italy, there is evidence of criminal involvement in hospitals in other regions, including particularly the epicenter initially of the pandemic in Italy, that was Lombardy and the region near Venice. By placing mafiosi in key positions within hospital management and health departments, these criminal networks are able to divert investments originally aimed at providing the financial resources, the equipment, the essential supplies, and influence procurement, commercial agreements, and recruitment processes within the healthcare system. So I will not go into details, but an investigation recently in Italy revealed that ambulances controlled by the 'Ndrangheta were riddled with inadequacies, including defective gearboxes, broken brakes and lights, lack of crucial equipment. Therefore, were kind of unable to really provide the service that they are supposed to provide. So corruption and criminal exploitation are global public health challenges. In procurement, as I said, is the diversion of funds, the wrong allocation of resources, the individual level corruption of bribes paid for preferential medical treatment, and the ability to flout quarantine restrictions. So in Europe, high percentages of patients, the last one I saw was about 21%, have reported having to pay bribes for preferential health treatment. In some countries, it's pretty high. In Slovakia, 41%, for example. In Slovenia, 28%. And the US healthcare system has long been also a target for criminal groups. A report by Thomson Reuters, a news agency with pretty much being respected, estimated that between 3 and 10% of the value of the total healthcare expenditures in the US is stolen, which is about $220 billion a year. There is already previous experience in this when we had in 2014 to 2016 the Ebola outbreak. And this has been well documented in the US and of course in other countries. And then there is the chronic underfunding that this creates, because fraud, corruption, the eroded capacity will make the struggles of the healthcare sector even more significant, including its ability to respond effectively to this crisis. So the rising demand, limited resources create the perfect condition for corruption to worsen. Counterfeit, substandard, illegally diverted pharmaceuticals are possibly among the world's most pressing illegal trade problems generally, and especially today. A lucrative criminal industry that is estimated at about almost $500 billion a year is also a massive public health threat, obviously, and targets disproportionately the most vulnerable, those who are sick and who are poor, and they have to depend on public assistance. Substandard and ineffective drugs can worsen the conditions of sick individuals, hinder the accurate diagnosis of their illness, accelerate the spread of communicable diseases, increase the drug resistance in the population, reduce the confidence that people have in their health institutions, and ultimately kill people. So there is no question that in some regions of the world, counterfeit pharmaceutical markets are controlled by powerful criminal organizations that may use their influence over institutions and the threat of violence to flout regulation and bring counterfeit products to market. For example, in Mexico, research has shown that at times 6 out of every 10 medical products is falsified, is expired, or is stolen. So there is, for example, a cartel in the state of Jalisco, one of the most widespread and violent criminal organizations that operate in that country, that promotes the production of pirated drugs and forces many small and medium-sized pharmacies to sell them in the state of Jalisco and other neighboring states, Guerrero, Michoacán, Guanajuato, and so on and so forth. So as hospital resources become overburdened during this crisis, and we see it happening right now in India, where the medical system has totally collapsed. There is no oxygen, there are no hospital beds, there is no medical care for the majority of the people, and the number of deaths is enormous. The vulnerability of the health systems to criminal profiteering is likely to become even more pronounced. So basically, also we have to say that criminal interests have also been very well exploiting people's fears of the virus and are preying on the public's need for assurance, protection, the faith that they place in trusted institutions to opportunistically profit from the chaos. The last point, that I want to make on this is that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that cyber scams, fraud, disinformation, and other cyber-enabled crimes have become a growth industry as people on lockdown kill time online. So lockdowns may be controlled, the lockdowns put in place to control the spread of the coronavirus may generate new demand for illicit businesses, particularly those that are cyber-enabled. There are millions of people that find themselves homebound, isolated, bored, economically constrained. And so there is a whole series in the US at least, but also in other countries, in Europe particularly, of coronavirus-related phishing scams that have emerged where cyber criminals have impersonated many trusted sources of information and health agencies, the World Health Organization and the local Center for Disease Control in the US, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much. I just hate interrupting you. Thank you so much, Professor Emilio Viano. By this moment, could you please just conclude your speech, just less than a minute?
Certainly, gladly. I just wanted to mention, to finish this point, the increase in pornography, and there has been data in the US showing that pornographic sites have seen an enormous increase in their subscriptions, and also mostly the sexual exploitation of children to be shared between private user groups and forums. So it is an enormous part, a silent part of the impact of coronavirus crisis and the lockdown and the commission of crimes, particularly related to sexual exploitation of children or of drug addicts or of women and others who are dependent on criminals. So there has been an enormous increase in clientele for organized crime, in fraud schemes, romance scams. Romance scams at times make us a little smile, but they hurt people tremendously, and also lotteries and other scams. To conclude, I would like to say that there is no question that the pandemic has constrained initially organized crime, but organized crime is very versatile, also thanks to the network built by corruption, and has found new ways to make billions and to commit crimes against public health, the defenseless, those who mostly need it, the poor, those who cannot access the health system, and to earn billions of dollars, particularly now with falsified medicine and related products that people associate with fighting the pandemic or protecting themselves from the pandemic. Also, the fact that there has been a limit in the crossing of frontiers has initially limited the activities of organized crime, but now they have found ways around it, again, often through corruption, and therefore they have, in a way, an easier way, because there is less competition in bringing about their nefarious activities, particularly human smuggling and human exploitation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Viano, for your speech. Thank you. And by this moment, please let me give the floor to our next prominent expert, to our next speaker, please, Jeffrey Danik. You're welcome, sir. Mr. Danik, please turn on your mic.
How is that?
Thank you. That's good.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed the comments so far, and I've learned several things, so definitely thank you for that. Greetings from Florida. That's where I'm at today. I'm thankful for being invited to share some comments on these topics today. I went through and I made some notes. The first question involves both national, which I interpret as the United States, and transnational or international developments since our last meeting. So I think maybe in the group, I'm the more non-academic member, a more on the street type, maybe perspective. And that's kind of where my research and preparing my comments today took me to more rather interpretive, but illustrative examples of what has happened. And it's funny, it does dovetail well with the comments that preceded me. So since our last meeting, what has happened? There have been some large scale enforcement issues despite the pandemic. We have had some major corruption enforcement actions occur both in the United States and internationally. Although very few, it is true, very few individuals and no government officials appear to have been fully held accountable. I think it is coming, but fully held accountable yet. Definitely the companies have been held accountable. So for instance, we have in the United States, and it also has an international aspect to it, one of the largest investment banks, financial institutions on the planet, Goldman Sachs. So they were, since our last meeting, they've resolved their involvement with their Malaysian subsidiary in a large international corruption probe. And they've had to pay $2.9 billion in fines and fees to settle those charges of corruption. Those are payments to foreign officials to facilitate the issuance of bonds that the subsidiaries and Goldman Sachs made money on, fees related to the sale to the public and to institutions of those bonds. So what's significant about that case since our last meeting is that a Goldman Sachs subsidiary actually pled guilty to criminal activity, the Malaysian branch. So this case would have taken a lot of the US and foreign government entities' energy, especially during the pandemic, to bring to a close. So that would be one of the first big developments, that the One Malaysia Bank development case, as it's called here in the United States, or One MDB is how it's often referred to in the press, has been settled, at least as it relates to one of our most powerful financial institutions in the United States, Goldman Sachs. So that's, but Goldman Sachs was not alone in the enforcement of corruption investigations and coming under government scrutiny. We also had an international corporation, Airbus, settle a large investigation. I think it was going on for 4 years. It had potential to become criminal, which would have been very impactful on the company. It would greatly have affected their ability to contract with certain government agencies had they been forced into a criminal resolution of their corruption allegations. And instead, they were able to cobble together or put together a United States, France, and Britain settlement that the three governments agreed to go ahead and take a monetary payment and have extra oversight of their operations. So you have two major corruption enforcement actions of international and extremely important US national impact. which I think is both significant and both important in understanding where the priorities internationally and in the United States are in enforcement. The other developments we have had, and these have almost paradigm changing impact in our lives and our economy, are the two computer cyber attacks that have happened since our last meeting. So we have had the hack of SolarWinds here in the United States was found out. And this is a extremely devastating nation state attack. The authorities in the United States, at least, are attributing the attack to Russia or Russian military. And I'm not saying I adopt or adapt to that, although there are plenty of government documents to go to that say that. I'm just reporting what is in the public domain. And this is a devastating attack. It shows the soft supply chain for code that we rely on to update our systems, to make our systems have more integrity, our networks and our enterprises. And a sophisticated attacker was able to infiltrate the SolarWinds supply chain and get many, many entities to upload its updates, which installed backdoors into the enterprise system of the victim. And the damage is extreme. It's not quantified yet. We do not know what the total damage is, and it's still being discovered. Daily, there's updates on it. The other, if that wasn't bad enough, we have recently had what the US authorities are attributing to Chinese nation state actors, an attack on probably the largest software company on the planet, Microsoft. So their Exchange servers have had a hack, and this hack is devastating also. The attackers have gained access to many US government systems. They have gained access to many technological companies. And again, it's still new and it's still unknown the amount of grave damage, but we do know that these two attacks are on the scale and coming one after the other like something we've never seen before. So those are the really large developments. Originally, I had thought that I would be maybe presenting some information. We've passed a new money laundering law in the United States, which money laundering is primarily aimed at the criminal element. And it's a foundational law or set of laws in the US that we use to prosecute and hold criminal enterprises accountable. And it has never been updated or hasn't been significantly updated since the Patriot Act came out in 2001. The US Patriot Act was enacted in response to the attacks in 9/11 of September 11, 2001. This is the first major overhaul, and it's really an important overhaul because what it does is it takes into account a lot of the technology advancements and expands the law and the regulatory authority to collect more information about these criminal elements by exploiting technology that has developed since 2001, right? Even a few years ago, the technology is much different today than a few years ago. So if you unwind to 2001, there's an extreme difference. So these are some of the big areas nationally and transnationally that have occurred that have a big impact in my view. geopolitically, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a new president. So that means new leadership in our enforcement elements, both criminal and regulatory. So that's quite a big change, at least in the US since our last meeting. And the US is coming out of the COVID lockdown phase. So the economy and at least the activity and the people on the street and the restaurants and the airlines are expecting recovery throughout the year. So these are in the US, some of the biggest developments. It's all, I always have to bring in my final 2 points. I always have to talk a little bit about terrorism. So terrorism, we have ISIS coming up again. They are emboldened and are growing in strength, all the public statements about them, which again is many of the terrorist groups use criminal enterprises to raise money for their terrorist operations, both kidnapping, drug running, that type of thing. They obtain that money also through bribes and corruption of state officials. So they're on the march again. Central Africa, Mozambique, Congo, these are places that are difficult for us to have partnerships and significantly responsive enforcement actions. And this is what the criminals do to us, right? They go to places where they can exist without oversight. Then they use borders to hide from us and make it difficult for us to reach them. Then they use techniques of cover and concealment, primarily the internet, to thwart or stop our attribution of who is actually conducting the crime. So ISIS is no stranger to that theory, and also they're in a fertile ground of people that are easier to recruit, target, and recruit to their ideologies. And finally, the cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, cyber is our biggest threat vector, but it's being enabled by cryptocurrency. So if you're not a state actor attacking another country for purposes of doing economic damage or stealing secrets or stealing technology, if you're not that, everything else is about money. And cryptocurrency allows the international criminal cartels to hide, to do just what I was saying a moment ago, to hide attribution. So if we follow the money hits a dead end, hopefully, according to the criminals. And cryptocurrency and the trading of the entire market and ecosystem regarding cryptocurrency is, and that's in my next set of comments for the prognosis for 21, is a very significant threat vector. And since our last meeting, cryptocurrency has been a big topic in the United States, more among the masses of people, not just finance professionals. It's becoming more ingrained. In my view, I've seen many more news programs, many more people that you would never think would discuss cryptocurrency are discussing cryptocurrency. So those are my comments related to the first question. And I'll talk to you later on the second question.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your speech. And right now, please let me give the floor to our next speaker, Professor James Finkenauer. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Okay, can you hear me?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me once again to participate. And I always learn something through this participation. The new points of view and new ideas and new findings and so on, which makes it all quite interesting for me. What's fortuitous is that after having been invited to participate today, I had the opportunity, received actually a report from an organization called the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime. Just this, within the last few weeks, I got the copy of this report. And I read it over and I thought, holy cow, this report is directly on point to the topics that are proposed to be discussed in our upcoming forum. So if you will bear with me, I'd like to talk to you about some of the findings and some of the conclusions that have come out of this report, which, as I say, the report's less than a month old. So it's quite current in terms of the approach that they've taken. To begin, the report itself is called the Global Illicit Economy. And there are 5 illicit markets that are identified in this report. These markets are as follows. The first one is human exploitation. The second one is the illicit environment exploitation, which means things like illegal logging, illegal fishing, wildlife, which Professor Viano mentioned, this wildlife trafficking, exploitation of the environment in some form. Drugs and drug trafficking, cybercrime, which has also been mentioned several times, and the illegal trade in illicit and counterfeit goods, which has also been mentioned. So these 5 areas are identified in this report as the major illicit economies that exist in the world today. And I like to take just one of these because it happens to be the one I'm most interested in, and that's the one on human exploitation. I've done a fair amount of work on human smuggling and human trafficking, therefore my interest in this one in particular. If we go back, step back a little bit to look at, well, what is it, what's primarily accounting for human exploitation? The answer on the one hand is quite simple. Socioeconomic inequality in the world. The fact that there are have countries and have not countries, and even within the so-called have countries, there are people who are haves and have nots. And this difference accounts for a great deal of the foundation for the exploitation of the have nots. The report points out something I didn't know, by the way, that the informal economy accounts for 60% of the global workforce. 60% of the global workforce are engaged in what they call the informal economy. Now, what is that? What's the informal economy? It's day workers. It's people who every day are trying to get some job to do that day. They don't have a salary. They don't have any kind of job benefits. They don't have any long-term security in their jobs and so on. They are trying to survive day by day by day the best way they can. Now, what's happened is that those opportunities to do that existed prior to the pandemic have now been reduced as a consequence of the pandemic. I think has already been mentioned. People who would go out on the street to sell things, for example, forgetting how they may have gotten to things in the first place, but they're on the street to sell things. Now all that has been closed down. So what do these people do that they can no longer go on the street and they don't have this anymore as an opportunity, if you will, to make some kind of living? How about the people who worked in the tourist industries? All of the hotels and all of the travel spots and vacation spots and so on that have been shut down, where the local population in those areas depended upon those things continuing to operate. That was their source of their living. That's now been shut down. So and that's an enormous area, and a lot of those countries that were popular tourist sites have a lot of have-nots living in those countries that were dependent on this tourism for their survival. So a lot of that has now been cut down. Well, these people have to survive somehow. So what happens when you shut down the legal economy? people begin to look to other avenues. They begin to look at what is the illegal economy. And of course, they get coerced by traffickers and smugglers into various kinds of illegal operations. And this is where we see the connection between the exploitation more generally and specifically human smuggling and human trafficking, particularly involving children, for example. So we see a connection between the illicit economies and the licit economy. For example, take logging. Logging is not an illegal activity. However, there are controls, there are regulations about logging, how much logging can occur, where it can occur, and so on. So now what happens is there's a development of black markets involving logging. And and then there are people who are looking for jobs who are brought in now into cutting down trees and loading trees and doing the various things that are involved with logging. So those people get employed. Fishing, same thing with fishing. Fishing is regulated. And fishing itself inherently is not an illegal activity, but there are regulations about it that now become exploited by transnational organized criminals who exploit these particular markets. So we see that the reduced, what's also happened is that the regulation of those markets, the normal inspections and the normal law enforcement that would occur under normal situations has been reduced and compromised during the pandemic because states don't have the resources to focus on those areas. They're focusing and doing other things. Therefore, you have increased demand and reduction in enforcement and inspection, which creates a criminal market opportunity in all of these areas. So, additional thing has happened. This is all sort of on the supply side, if you will. Why are there these potential criminals out there and who's exploiting them and where are they coming from and so on. To the demand side, what's happened is many countries are failing to provide safe and secure opportunities for movement across their borders. In fact, the opposite has occurred. If we take the United States, for example, those of you who paid attention to what was going on in the US over the last 4 years under the previous administration know that we were not a particularly welcoming country for migrants coming across our borders. I think as our former president said at one point, why don't we just get people to come from Norway? Why do we have these people coming from Africa and Central America and so on? So increasing regulation has occurred, increasing difficulty around people being able to come into the country. Has that reduced the demand? No. The demand is being pushed by these other factors that I've already mentioned, what's going on and the loss of opportunities and so on. And so those persons are now looking to move to this new opportunity that they see coming available to them. So you have increased restriction. And it's not just the United States. Countries of Europe also are not that welcoming of people coming from Syria or people coming from Africa. Bangladesh is not that welcoming of people coming from Myanmar. So you have all around the world, different places where countries are restricting their intake or the ability of migrants to come into the countries. Because the demand remains the same, what happens? The price goes up, right? All of a sudden, this becomes a much more lucrative criminal market because the demand is there. Also, the difficulty is increased. So the kind of mom and pop operations, low-level informal traffickers who knew how to manipulate things, they get driven out of the business by the sophisticated transnational groups who have the connections and the skill and the know-how to continue to exploit these and maybe pay off the corruption where that's necessary. They got the money to pay people off. So that continues, that operation continues, more restrictions. We build walls, we enforce all sorts of things, and yet people still find ways to do this. I see on the news traffickers dropping children over the top of walls on a rope over to the other side. So this notion that somehow we can close ourselves down and close the borders and prevent anybody from coming in wherever, it's not just true in the US, wherever this is occurring, this is just not realistic. And it does create criminal opportunity for sophisticated transnational groups, and they are exploiting this. So I will stop there and I'll hold my comments about, so what might be done about this to the next round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor James Finkenauer. Thank you for your speech. And by this moment, let's switch to our second question. So the second question for the discussion is the prognosis for the next year, for 2021, prognosis and relevant crime prevention methods. And by this moment, please let me give the floor to our honorable speaker, Professor Emilio Viano. Please, you're welcome, sir. Please turn on your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is no question that we have to modify the way in which we address crime. The transnational threats and the evolving modi operandi of organized crime group that operate offline and online call for a more coordinated, more targeted and adapted response. And it is one of the dilemmas and difficulties that we face, that national authorities that operate on the ground are on the front line in the fight against organized crime. Action at a more international level is paramount to ensure effective cooperation as well as sharing of information, knowledge among national authorities. We also need more of a common criminal law framework and effective financial means. Also, organized crime is emblematic of the link between internal and external security. International engagement on countering organized crime, including develop partnership and cooperation with countries in the immediate neighborhood and beyond, is absolutely needed to address this transnational challenge. So basically, what I think that we need to do, both inside the country, as big as the US, for example, or maybe within the European Union, or among other countries, is to boost law enforcement and judicial cooperation. For example, let me quote you statistics. In the European Union, 65% of the criminal groups that are active in the EU are composed by members of multiple nationalities. So transport routes of drugs, firearms, counterfeit medicine span across the continents through a global supply chain. Mobile organized crime group are engaged in organized property crime, move quickly across multiple jurisdictions to carry out their crimes. So by operating across different jurisdictions, they avoid detection, exploit the differences of the applicable criminal laws. This reminds us of one of the strengths and weaknesses of the United States. We have seen during this coronavirus pandemic, but that was already shown at the beginning of the Republic in some of the Western movies, where the sheriff is pursuing the thieves, the cattle, stealing cattle, and they arrive at a river, and the river is the boundary, the frontier between one county, one jurisdiction, and the next one. And so the thieves cross the river laughingly, and the sheriff has to stop at the river. He cannot go to the other side. Well, that was in the 1800s, probably. Today, we still can do that at the national borders, that the thieves can continue going while the law enforcement has to stop. This happens also in the US today, where there is a lot of jurisdictions, 51 jurisdiction minimum at the state level, and then local jurisdictions, sheriffs, chiefs of police, that often don't cooperate with each other. A famous case was a few years ago when someone was released from prison and he promptly kidnapped a child, a female child, and took her with him in the trunk of his car. The parents reported the crime. The police sent out an advisory to look for this particular crime. It happens that the sheriff stopped this man because he made, an infraction in the code, in a driving infraction. And he settled it with him and let him go. And the young child was in the trunk of the car. The result was that he abused her sexually and killed her. Why was this happening? Because the police and the sheriff had different radio frequencies. So the police could be understood and heard only by police, the sheriff only by the sheriff. Well, this is an extreme example, but one child lost her life, her parents lost their child. Well, at the national and international level, we have to have smooth exchanges, timely access to information. And of course, in the European Union, they started that with the Schengen information system, particularly giving Europol a more important role in the European Union. It's also a question of interoperability. That is what was not working in the case I mentioned. Their radio system were not interoperable. So the information systems have to be fully interoperable. And there is also an example again in the European Union called the PRIM framework, but I don't have time to go into that. What else do we need to do? Well, I think that important also today with the facility to travel is, and given the international dimension of organized crime, travel information is of the essence to identify risk travelers, high-risk travelers, who are not otherwise known to law enforcement agencies. Now, again, we have that, or somewhat today. There is the processing of the passenger name record. There is the system of the advanced passenger information that has been imposed, particularly by the US, especially in Europe and in other countries. And this certainly can be helpful. A revision of the current legal framework for all of this would allow many improvements, notably on the accuracy of the data and the completeness of the data. Then we also need to have advanced cooperation frameworks. In other words, have cooperation between different police bodies that often are competing with each other. We see that even here in the US, when at times the federal police, the FBI, the ATF, other the Homeland Security might not necessarily cooperate with local police and vice versa. So the importance to cooperate more, to share in that respect, again, in the European Union, since you are close to it in your country, Europol plays quite an important role in the EU Criminal Information Hub. Still, there is a need for improving this, for opening platforms on multiple criminal threats that are very, and there are, of course, complexity here. For example, member states and their partners carry out 200 joint operational actions every year, like almost military maneuvers, but that needs to be strengthened. What else is there that we should be doing? Well, is international cooperation. I was talking about cooperation between the states in the European Union, between the states, the 51 in the US, and within a state and within a county, between the police and the sheriff. But we also have to talk about international cooperation. So law enforcement cooperation beyond the European Union, beyond the US, is necessary to disrupt the global criminal networks and the transport routes. It is essential to set up international cooperation, including through the activities of the justice and home affairs agencies. And this is certainly very, very important. Interpol is trying to do that up to a point, but Interpol is more like almost a database and a bulletin board, and therefore it's not as efficient as it could be. We have now, of course, for many years, the United Nations Conventions against transnational organized crime. and the EU and member states are party of it. And certainly there is the importance of bringing up our legislation, the EU legislation, in this case also the USA legislation, to this particular international convention. So those are some of the things. Other things that we should do: if effective investigations, disrupting organized crime and tackling high priority crimes is a complex task. So we have to step up the efforts in tackling organized crime structure. In other words, the focus of law enforcement should not stop at the seizure of illegal items or the arrest of some of the criminals, even cartel leaders. The networks that are the backbone of the criminal ecosystems should be the focus. Give you an example. Here in the US, we celebrated, or the government celebrated, the arrest of the Chapo Guzman, who was the head of a cartel of Sinaloa. And he had a history of escaping from prison and bribing his way out. They even built a tunnel outside, from the outside to his cell in the prison in Mexico. Now he is in a maximum security prison in Colorado, sentenced by the US to life in prison. But arresting him doesn't stop the flow of drugs, doesn't stop the Sinaloa cartel. It only means that someone else took over, that someone else is now doing it. So dismantling organized crime structure should be our priority. Targeting the groups that are at a higher risk, that pose a higher risk to Europe, to the US, to any country. So that's another important thing, not to celebrate just seizures. We seized 200 kilos of cocaine. We found so many kilos of marijuana. This doesn't solve the problem. And it is very often used more to show that something is happening than really taking care of what we should do. Let's go after high-value targets, which are often mostly the network itself and the structure of itself. And here is where intelligence plays a very important role. And then also have tailor-made responses to specific forms of crime. There are some groups that are specialized in particular criminal markets. Others are polycriminal. In other words, they do different types of criminality. But it's very important to, in this case, make a response that is tailor-made to specific, like let's say migrant smuggling or new psychoactive substances, and so on and so forth. So the importance of concentrating on this. For example, in the US, an area where we need to do something is firearms, because firearms are a key enabler of the increase in violence by criminal groups. They allow them to intimidate an opponent. They allow them to exert control over their members in the markets. So an action plan against firearms trafficking, also because of the spike in homicides in the US recently, is absolutely essential. And luckily, the current government under President Biden appears to be committed to try to do something about it. The same, of course, is an action plan against migrant smuggling, trafficking in human beings, cybercrime that has been amply mentioned. And we know that, for example, in Europe, in the European Union, there is a European cybercrime center at Europol, and that goes after organized crime threats assessment when cybercrime is in play. We could talk about protection of children as well, child sexual abuse. We don't have the time, but that is also an important area. Also, and this is mentioned in the context of Bitcoin, there is an increase in non-cash means of payment. In China, for example, cash has basically disappeared and credit cards have basically disappeared. I teach at the University of Shanghai, and I've seen that happening in recent years. And they kind of laugh at Europe and the US that still uses credit cards and cash. But that has, of course, also a tremendous potential when we use mostly non-cash means of payment, like credit cards for us, or for them in China, online payment tools that can present a very serious threat to the security. And they are a very important source of income for organized crime and enable criminal activities, particularly drug trafficking and human trafficking. Related to this, the whole question of fraud and counterfeiting, which is a very high impact crime. Counterfeit products represent almost 7% of the imports into the European Union. We already mentioned before medical, healthcare, sanitary products that constitute a very increasing share of counterfeiting with very sad consequences, as we mentioned already in the context of the previous presentation. So particularly the counterfeiting of medical products should be a very, very important priority for the member states. So basically, and then of course there is environmental crime. There is even the issue of the waste shipment regulations. When we ship waste from the US, from Europe to certain countries in Africa or South Asia. And then of course we already mentioned the wildlife trafficking. The cultural goods, this is also another large area, a devastating impact on countries' heritage, cultural and historic heritage. So basically, these are the areas that I consider very, very important. The last one is eliminating the profits generated by organized crime and preventing the infiltration of those profits into the legal economy and society. And we can do this by reinforcing asset recovery, anti-money laundering, promoting financial investigations. And here is where, of course, the whole discourse of virtual currencies that Professor Finkenauer mentioned before is very, very important. So the early financial investigations, the freezing, the confiscation, and the asset recovery efforts that we can make. I will stop here. Again, in stressing how important it is to have anti-money laundering treaties, but also operational networks, which are extremely important, and stepping up the anti-corruption measures in our midst, even when they affect powerful people and powerful politicians. We see that in part here in the US, where possibly there may be more information and even maybe a prosecution of the previous president because he has been suspected of, as we say in our English, cooking the books. In other words, not always reporting correctly the taxes he owed, maybe even inflating the value of his properties and utilizing different means to evade the proper reporting of income. So it would be good for us, as an example, to have that prosecution, if it is warranted, of course, to show that the law is equal for everyone, but most of all, that there is a commitment to anti-corruption in our country.
Thank you so much, Professor Emilio Viano, for your speech. And right now, let me please give the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Oleg Maltsev. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. So the second question is like an eternal question, is about what should we do? I mean, what is going to happen?
Я опять бы хотел вернуться к работе итальянской 1860 года по криминологии.
And I would like to refer again to the work of 1860 work, Italian manual about the criminology.
Где, в общем-то, достаточно подробно и созвучно с тем, что я думаю, написано.
Where it says quite with detail and very close with my standpoint.
Первое — менять законы.
First thing, first bullet point, that we should change the laws, I mean, introduce modifications.
Но не просто менять законы, а поменять их так, чтобы они разрешили этот конфликт между демократически избранными институтами и как бы фактическими обстоятельствами, в которых мы как бы живем, которые требуют профессионала.
But the laws should be changed not for the sake of changing them, but in a way they will finally resolve the conflict between the democratically elected institutions and the necessity to have real professionals to tackle the tasks that are at hand.
Мой коллега из Соединенных Штатов Америки как бы сказал, что, слава богу, появился закон, который позволяет немножко больше узнавать о гражданах.
One of my colleagues from the United States of America shared the news that the new regulations were introduced in the US, and one of the points of it that it allows to find out more information about citizens that are conducting criminal activities.
Вот у меня как бы всегда возникает вопрос, а зачем еще немножко больше знать о гражданах?
So I always come up with the thought, why would government would want to know a little bit more about its citizens?
Самое смешное из всего этого, что все-то преступники известны.
The most funny thing about this whole situation is that all criminals are very well known.
Да, и вся проблема — посадить их на скамью подсудимых и изолировать от общества.
The whole problem is to bring them before the law and isolate from the society.
То есть вот большинство людей считают, что надо спецслужбам дать как можно больше полномочий, чтобы они как можно лучше боролись с преступностью.
Many people think that special intelligence services should be given more and more freedom, more and more possibilities in what they can do, so that they become more effective to combat criminalization.
А я, наоборот, считаю, что спецслужбы надо жестко ограничить в их полномочий и заставить бороться с преступностью.
And I, for one, have a different viewpoint on this. I think that special intelligence services should be strictly limited in in the scope of what they are allowed to do, and actually force them to really fight against the criminals.
Позвольте я объясню.
And please allow me to clarify what I mean.
Вы знаете, когда на конвейере на заводе что-то не получается с машиной, какая-то деталь не та, ее меняют.
So as an example, in the factory, when we have this basically line, assembly line, when something goes wrong and something doesn't work properly, that detail, that part is just changed. They put a new one.
Вот смотрите, все религии мира на протяжении, как нам говорят, 2000 лет боролись со грехом.
So allegedly, as people think, all main religions in the world have been fighting against the sin in the course of 2000 years, allegedly.
Побороли?
Did they, did they succeed in their fight against the sin?
Нет.
No, they didn't.
Наши правоохранительные органы борются с преступностью. Побороли?
The same thing with our law enforcement agencies. They're fighting against the criminalization. Are they successful in this?
Нет.
No, they're not.
То есть, когда что-то не работает, это надо менять.
So every time when something is not functional, it has to be replaced by what is functional.
Это очень просто.
It is very simple.
То есть нужна другая конфигурация спецслужб.
It's all about having a different configuration of special intelligence services.
То есть пока мы не поменяем те конфигурации спецслужб, которые сегодня существуют, толку в борьбе с преступностью не будет никакой.
Unless the configuration of the current special intelligence services are changed, there will be no really effect in fighting organized crime or any crime for that matter.
Вот давайте посмотрим объективно на вещи.
Let's take a look, an objective look at the factual state of affairs.
Как все говорят, самая ужасная страна в мире, которая когда-либо существовала, это СССР.
As historically, it's believed that the most real horrible country that ever existed is USSR.
Это жуткое, мерзкое, деспотичное, ужасное государство, слава богу, которого больше нет.
A horrible, despotic, nasty state, which thank God doesn't exist anymore.
Но обратите внимание,
However, please pay attention.
это единственная страна в мире, которая победила преступность.
That it was an only state worldwide that was able to effectively combat crime.
В Советском Союзе было 92% раскрываемости преступлений.
Back in USSR, they had 92% of resolving or finding out who is the criminal.
И никто права граждан не нарушал.
And meanwhile, by doing so, nobody did violate citizens' rights.
То есть, если был обыкновенный гражданин, который на завод, на работу ходил, никому не нужно было еще чуть-чуть знать об этом гражданине и еще чуть-чуть законов для спецслужб увеличить, чтобы они еще чуть-чуть знали про этого гражданина.
So to give a simple example, for instance, we have a factory worker that would attend his work every day. Nobody would want to know, have an access to more information about the citizen, or to give more power and possibilities to special intelligence services. No, this was not necessary.
Вот обратите внимание, в свое время слушал интервью одного из бывших директоров разведки Израиля.
Recently, I have listened to an interview of former special intelligence services of Israel.
И он сказал, когда журналист ему задал вопрос, чего им не хватает, он удивился от вопроса, как бы.
And when this former officer of Israeli service was asked by a journalist, what else you are lacking, what you do not have, he was very surprised at the question itself.
Он сказал, да в законе все написано.
He said, well, everything is already outlined in the legal system.
Когда можно проводить те мероприятия, когда можно проводить эти мероприятия, когда можно прослушивать телефон, когда можно... Все в законе написано, и выходить за рамки закона нельзя.
He said that everything is already clearly stated when you are allowed to conduct this or those activities, when it's possible to listen to the phones. I mean, every act has its own place, and you cannot trespass the law.
Я знаю как бы эту идею, когда спецслужбы, которые не умеют работать, сетуют на то, что у них связаны законом руки, поэтому они не могут побороть преступность.
And I mean, I have heard many times the situations or the opinions when special intelligence services say that, well, we do not have enough of freedom to do this or that, and that is why we are not that effective in combating the crime.
Обратите внимание, Советский Союз победил преступность только потому, что там отношение к правоохранительным органам было такое, что любой гражданин этого государства активно сотрудничал с правоохранительными органами, начиная от шерифа участкового и заканчивая уголовным розыском, понимаете? И по собственной воле, без принуждения.
The reason USSR was so successful in combating a crime is because the way people treated law enforcement agency representatives was very different than what is happening today. People, every citizen was interested in cooperating with law enforcement agencies and without forcing them. I mean, they had maybe a huge respect, if I may say so. So basically on every level, starting from a local representative, which in the US probably would be called a sheriff, and up to the highest ranks of the law enforcement agency.
То есть уважение у своего народа правоохранительные органы должны заслужить.
And the point is that the law enforcement agencies, they have to earn the respect of citizens.
То есть и пришли туда для того, чтобы этот народ защищать.
Because in the first place, they are on their positions in order to protect the nation.
а не для того, чтобы использовать свое служебное положение для собственного обогащения и обогащения криминальных структур.
And not to misuse their power for their self-interest, make themselves richer, and be cooperative with organized crime.
Второе.
Number 2 bullet point.
Для того, чтобы победить преступность, нужно быть сильнее преступности.
In order to combat the crime, one has to be more powerful than crime itself.
Сегодня организованная преступность организованнее и сильнее любого государства.
However, the factual state of affairs is as follows. Today, the organized crime is way more organized and way more powerful than people who are trying to battle with it.
И все потому, что политики этого государства крайне заинтересованы в сотрудничестве с этой организованной преступностью.
And the reason why governments are weaker, if we may say, less organized than organized crime, is only because the politicians of this or that state are interested in working together with organized crime.
И пока мы не введем ответственность президента, премьер-министра, уголовную ответственность за ту деятельность, которую они осуществляли в время своего президентства или пребывания в должности, пока президенты стран и президенты институтов государственных не начнут садиться на скамью подсудимых за сотрудничество с криминальными структурами публично, толку никакого не будет.
And unless the leaders of the nations, the presidents and people that are leading governmental institutions, if they are not held accountable, in front of the law publicly for their criminal acts or for their acts of cooperating with organized crime, if they are not really have the charges, then this is not going to stop.
Пока правоохранительные органы будут зависимы от государства, тоже толку никакого не будет.
The same thing applies to if the law enforcement agencies are completely dependent on the state, it is also not going to bear any fruits.
Что толку говорить о существовании любой конфигурации спецслужб, когда приходит преступник-президент, ставит преступника премьер-министра и расставляет всех своих людей во все правоохранительные органы? О какой борьбе с преступностью вообще может идти речь?
So what is the point of talking about changing the configuration of special intelligence services, or what is the point of combating the organized crime or crime in general when there is a president who is elected, is a criminal, who appoints a prime minister who is like somebody, who would later on appoint the relatives to the law enforcement agents? I mean, there is no even point of talking against combating if things are like this.
То есть пока политики европейских государств и Соединенных Штатов Америки не начнут садиться за скамью подсудимых, толку никакого не будет.
So unless the leaders of the European nations, of the US, unless they are brought before the law, before the court for things they do, things are not going to change.
И последнее. Дело в том, что любые изменения, они должны проводиться быстро и радикально, а не десятки тысяч лет.
And the last bullet point that I would like to mention, that any changes that are introduced should be done radically fast and very straightforwardly, very strictly, and not prolong them for 10,000 of years and make them very soft and mild transitions.
То есть, почему организованная преступность, она сильнее и умнее, чем все вокруг?
So what are the characteristics that make organized crime more organized, more smarter than everybody else?
Потому что она очень быстрая и мобильна.
The main characteristics is because it's very fast and it can adjust real quick.
Любой государственной структуре, чтобы что-то сделать, ей нужно посоветоваться с 50 политиками.
In contrast to this, for any governmental structure, in order to take a decision, it takes really a long time until they negotiate with 50 other people and come to a decision.
А, простите, если это касается преступности, то это все в секунды происходит.
In contrast to that, with organized crime, everything happens in seconds.
Это военная структура, то есть не получился этот канал доставки наркотиков, проанализировали ошибку, как бы нашли другой и погнали, как бы, и все.
So they act just like a military structure. To give a simple example, if they failed in one route of delivering the narcotics, okay, they find out another way, they analyze their mistake and change their tactics right away.
И обратите внимание, если президент или какой-то политик что-то совершил, как вы думаете, что ему будет?
And in contrast to that, if any president or any elected official does something illegal, criminal, we wonder what might happen to him or what will happen to him.
То есть Ангела Меркель первая нарушила Шенгенское соглашение в момент начала пандемии. Что из-за этого было?
Here's an example. The Chancellor of Germany did violate the Schengen law in the beginning of the pandemic. Did she bear any consequences for that act?
Ничего.
No, nothing.
Она вводит комендантский час в Германии. Что из этого будет?
So when she introduces a commandant hours in the Germany, will she face any consequences?
Ничего.
Nothing would happen to
Я
her.
могу перечислять до бесконечности.
And the list can go endlessly.
Как вы думаете, если у мафии что-то не получится, что будет тем, из-за которых не получилось?
Let's think of the mafia. Let's say something fails in their operation. What do you think will happen to the people that failed the task?
Я уверен, что все понесут достойное наказание. С их, безусловно, точки зрения мафиозной.
And I'm quite sure that people that were responsible for the failure will reap very, decent consequences for their actions, certainly according to the standards of that organized crime structure.
Поэтому, когда мы говорим об эффективности, безусловно, организованная преступность эффективнее любого государства.
So speaking about effectiveness of organized crime, then the answer is straightforward. Organized crime is way more effective than governmental structures, unfortunately.
Да, там возмездие наступает мгновенно.
Because the revenge and holding people accountable for what they do is instantaneous.
А у нас как бы мир поделен на неприкасаемых и прикасаемых. И прикасаемые — это, конечно, обыкновенные граждане, потому что, в принципе, они ничего ни государству, ни организованной преступности противопоставить не могут.
And where we live, in the world we live, it is roughly divided to untouchables and touchables. And obviously the touchables are the normal citizens and untouchables are people in power.
Вот представьте себе, в Германии я 2999 евро могу кому-то перевести, ну, на счет.
For instance, in Germany, I can wire to somebody's account 2,999 euros.
А 3000 не могу.
But I cannot wire 3,000 euros for somebody.
А зачем это?
And so why these regulations are introduced there?
Какая разница, какое количество вообще денег со счета перевожу частное лицо частному лицу?
Who would care what sum of money would just a normal private individual wire to another normal individual?
Вы скажете, ну мы боремся с отмыванием денег, что вы такое говорите?
And they may say, well, we are fighting money laundering.
Что неизвестны все офшоры в мире, неизвестно сколько миллиардов долларов каждый день перечисляется с немецких банков в офшорные компании от разного рода контрагентов.
Isn't it obvious? Everybody knows how many offshore companies are there. Everybody knows how many billions of euros are wired from German banks to offshore companies.
Что неизвестно спецслужбам, сколько денег каждый день в швейцарские банки кладутся германскими чиновниками, и в общем-то, на это все смотрят вот так сквозь пальцы.
And special intelligence services know how many funds are invested to Swiss banks by German officials. But for some reason, everybody looks at these events through like almost closed eyes, as if they're not seeing these things.
Когда-то, я не помню, лет 6 назад было уголовное дело, когда 30 чиновников привлекли к уголовной ответственности в Германии за то, что их суммы там на счетах стали превышать там какую-то безумную сумму миллионов долларов, и швейцарские банки сами сообщили немецкому правительству об этом, что их чиновники кладут вот такие суммы денег, и посадили 30 человек. Это ничтожно мало. Ну, как бы это просто, ну, вот случай такой произошел. А спецслужбы Германии при этом сидели, смотрели, как эти деньги спокойно отвозятся в швейцарские банки и кладутся. И поэтому обязательно гражданина, любого гражданина Евросоюза, нужно ограничить 2999 евро, чтобы они, не дай бог, друг другу не перечислили.
And so about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a case when 30 elected officials in Germany were brought to court and imprisoned because the Swiss bank itself reported to German government that bank accounts of these elected officials have huge sums of money, which like trespasses a certain threshold. But this was an only case. I mean, and it's a small, tiny case when we look at the global things, what things are happening. And certainly the special intelligence services knew what the elected officials are already doing. However, when in today's world, of course, they should limit the rights of European citizens by limiting normal citizens and make them wire 2,999 euros.
Обратите внимание, кто никогда не сталкивался с итальянским правосудием?
Did anybody ever faced Italian law system, legal system?
А там вообще никто никуда не спешит.
And in that, if we're speaking about them, nobody is in a rush. Everything is done very slowly.
Шли годы.
It's been like years and years.
Да, то есть как в такой стране не может быть мафии?
And if with such speeds, like real slow speeds, of course there will be mafia.
Там любого мафиози могут судить до того момента, пока он умрет.
Because like in Italy, roughly speaking, they can have the courts and trials with the mafiosi for years until he dies.
Да, и он будет находиться на свободе и дальше продолжать заниматься тем, чем он занимается.
And meanwhile, they are trying to come up with the decision and the sentence that criminal, he would be in the freedom and successfully continuing his daily activities.
То есть, когда стоит вопрос, какие прогнозы, ну, как бы ничего не поменяется.
And so when answering the question of the panel, when we speak about the prognosis for 2021, unfortunately, nothing is going to change unless those things that I've spoken in the beginning would be integrated.
То есть, вариант один, то, что не работает, надо менять. Менять, как написано еще в 1860 году в этой работе по криминологии. Я уверен, таких работ написано достаточно, только на них никто не обращает как бы внимания.
So there's only one option that might make drastic changes in the current situation is to replace things that are not functional with things that really work. And it has been already written in 1860 criminology book. And I'm quite sure there are more sources like this that were written way back ago. It's just nobody really pays attention to them.
И деятельность правоохранительных органов в государстве оценивается не потому, сколько людей они задушили публично под видеокамеры в год или застрелили на глазах изумленной публики, а по эффективности пресечения преступной деятельности. И я хочу, чтобы это было совершенно четко, не нарушая права граждан.
And any special intelligence service of any country, it has to be assessed not based on the number of killings and shots that they did publicly, but on the effectiveness of the way they counter crime, not violating other citizens' rights. And so I think this is a very important point to remember.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltsev, for your speech. And right now, I'm pleased to give the floor to our next speaker, to our next expert, Jeffrey Danik. Please, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you. I turned my mic on, so can you hear me?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Prognosis for 2021 and methods of prevention. I agree. This is the standard look into the future question, and it's always an interesting one to have an opportunity to address. So I don't think that much is going to change from what we've seen, because what has been happening has worked so well for the criminals up until now. And some of the new, some of the things that have been tried in the last year, maybe two, have brought so much success that I think we're going to see more of that. And particularly, I would say that we're going to see the attacks on the cyber front. They're going to be serious attacks. There are sophisticated cyber criminals in the world. They are acting with impunity, without any check or balance. They have massive budgets and tools because they are backed by regimes and governments, and that the ability to constantly and continually probe to find ways in is going to continue. And where that has a direct impact on us in our daily lives and in our businesses and for our families and for our universities and for our government structures is the attack of the infrastructure. The infrastructure being the banking systems, our military systems, our hospital systems, our electrical grid systems. These infrastructure attacks is what I fear the most will come in the coming year, basically foreshadowed by the two hacks that I brought up earlier, both the SolarWinds hack and the Microsoft hack. So SolarWinds is a company. Their stock is traded on one of the United States' largest large stock exchange companies. And there will be accountability for them. But you have a company like Microsoft, who we can talk about government actors not being held accountable. That's certainly true, and I'm in agreement with the group on this. But we have companies that aren't held accountable properly. And Microsoft continues to be hacked and hacked and hacked to the great devastation of many of its customers and clients. And there is no accountability for them that I ever see occur. But the Microsoft hack and the SolarWinds hack of this past year, this past 6 months, is what I fear going forward into 2021. As we finish this year, we'll see impacting our infrastructure. On a more base level with the transnational crime, I think we're going to continue to see the ransomware attack with the extortion, paired with the extortion of data leaking. So we hack your hospital, the cyber criminal hacks the hospital, and more than just locking the data so the hospital can't use it, disregarding the patients and the doctors that need to help critically ill patients, they could care less, the criminals. And rather than just hacking the data, they then extort the victim by posting some of the stolen data on the dark web that can be easily found. And that extortion piece is what has been very effective for the cyber criminals in the prior year, and which I'm highly confident that they'll continue to use through to 2021 until something's done about it. So what can we do in 2021? I think cooperation, we can get sour, or we can get frustrated with trying to cooperate and it not working out, but we have to continue to try to cooperate. So certainly events and exchanges like this, commitment to people that are on this panel and other panels, and academics and citizens need to hold the people accountable who are in these organizations, even if it doesn't appear to be effective, to continue to advocate and continue to argue that they need to cooperate, and they need to exchange information, and they need to take a larger global perspective of securing us and securing our data and securing our infrastructure from these attacks. The other thing we could do is we have, I know it's around the world, but in the United States, we have all these certificates and degrees you can get in cybersecurity. So you can get a highly specialized certificate in penetration testing. And many different disciplines have these intense courses of study, hands-on training, experience, and then certification. And I'm glad we have them, but something is not working. Something. We continue to be, it seems to me, if you zoom out a little bit and look at the problem, it seems like we are children in a very dangerous neighborhood, and we are just sitting prey for the bad guys. It's not even close. And so either we're not training enough people, our core, the good guy core is not large enough, or our skills aren't adequate enough, or our organizations are insular and they don't share the information once they find it out to save the others. There's something we're not doing correctly, and we need to spend time figuring out and identifying what it is to improve our cyber security response. The other thing I think we could do is invest more resources in the new technology of tracing the blockchain in cryptocurrency. So when you trade cryptocurrency, there's an electronic footprint of that is key to figuring out that the cryptocurrency is a legitimate transaction. And our government has made some strides in unwinding the cryptocurrency puzzle from the blockchain, being able to trace blockchain transactions through to what we call in the United States exfil, or exfiltration of the cryptocurrency into the fiat currency of whatever country the criminal is in. So if it was in the United States, converting the cryptocurrency, the Bitcoin, to US dollars. So that technology of tracing it to the exfil, and then the exfiltration is where the regulators are very strong. There is where they know their customer. There is where they know who took the money out, and that's where you can start tracing. So more investigation, more resources, more training, more academic study need to be done with the blockchain tracing technology that's out there. And I think that those areas are pretty wide sweeping and comprehensive, and are a lot to tackle in the coming year. But I really feel that those are the key issues related to the question. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your speech. Thank you. And right now, let me please give the floor to our next expert, James Finkenauer. You're welcome, Professor. Please turn on your mic. Once again, please. Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay. All right. Last but not least, let me say at the outset, it's much easier to talk about what the problem is than it is to talk about what the solutions are. This whole area of human exploitation, the thing that I focused on earlier, is driven by a number of factors, all of which are extremely difficult to try to think through how we might go about solving these things. For example, if we just take the issue of inequality, which I mentioned earlier, that it's the haves and the have-nots and so on. An answer to that, again, not a simple answer, an answer to that is socioeconomic development in the countries from which the migrants are coming. So if people are able to find jobs and economic opportunity at home, they have less reason than to leave home to go to some other country. If they're not leaving home to go to some other country, then they're not in a position to be hooked up with smugglers and traffickers because they're just not, giving business to those folks. But in addition to the inequality issue, we have violent conflicts and civil wars going on in countries. Syria being a prime example. Refugees fleeing Syria, trying to get across the Mediterranean into Europe. These people fleeing for their lives because it's dangerous to live where they're living. This means somehow resolving these conflicts and dealing with this civil environment that's producing this violence. Gangs, particular problem in Central America where the United States sees people coming from places like Guatemala and Honduras and so on. Big gang presence. Gangs are threatening to people in those countries. People want to leave the countries because it's dangerous to live there. Even something as universal and huge as climate change, for example. Climate change as it occurs is drying up, literally drying up or eliminating employment opportunities of certain kinds in certain countries, forcing those people to move elsewhere in order to have some socioeconomic wherewithal. As I said, these are all huge things. And by the way, they're not things which are subject to be solved by law enforcement or criminal justice. These are universal sorts of issues that will require all of the institutions that we have in order to try to confront them and try to do something about them. Let me just, I mentioned this report early on from the transnational organized crime folks. Here's what they say in conclusion about what they see this phenomenon is happening. They said there's a tremendous increase in xenophobic populism. Xenophobia, fear of foreigners. So this fear of foreigners combined with things like right-wing governments arising in certain countries, extreme forms of nationalism, which tend to go along with right-wing governments, and also a white supremacy notion. These things tend to be combined. Right-wing governments, nationalistic approaches, and white supremacy tend to be combined. This creates a certain perspective toward migrants. And who are the people hold these views? They tend by and large to be the haves. Who are the people trying to get in? They tend to be the black and brown people of the world who are trying to come from these other countries where all of these problems exist. So what this report says is that the increases in xenophobic populism combined with an increase in the push factors, the things that I mentioned, these are push factors, pushing people out of countries to move to other countries. Combined with the push factors, with an increased militarization of borders, the xenophobia means more stress on securing the borders, more militarization of those borders, making it harder for people to migrate. And at the same time, reducing the safe and legal migration routes. In other words, making it more difficult legally. We've done this in the United States. Fewer asylum courts to deal with claims of asylum and so on. Make it more difficult for people to migrate legally. an increased pool of potential migrants. And what do you have? You have a boon for traffickers and smugglers, who are the ones who can step in to try to work around these issues and try to help those people who, despite all the obstacles, are still trying to move from wherever they are into some other country. Now, one little glimmer of light on the horizon that I see, as travel opens up, there'll be some relaxation of travel requirements. People will be able to move more freely, and people will be moving to places to vacation and so on. Some of those job opportunities will come back, and crossing the borders will become a little bit easier. But in terms of these larger issues, the inequality issues, the civil war issues, the gangs and so on, there's not going to be any short-term and certainly easy solution to any of those problems. So on that pessimistic note, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor James Finkenauer, for his speech. And by this moment, I believe that actually it's high time we've finished our online discussion. So let me thank all the speakers, all the dear colleagues, experts. Yeah, so we have finished the roundtable discussion on organized crime and criminal traditions arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And by this, thank you so much for your kind attention and participation. See you soon. See you tomorrow. Have a nice time. Be safe. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.